You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 42. Amidst the sprinkling rain, Karyne breathed in the scent of something smoky like a campfire. Their proximity to Islara was almost palpable, and every new hint at civilization raised his spirits. "Karyne," Riverine whispered. Karyne glanced up to where Riverine sat astride Maw, a few paces ahead of Karyne and Skunk. But Riverine's eyes were on Aura, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. Karyne swiveled the other direction, turning Skunk so he could get a better look at Aura behind him. She sat atop her horse, eyes closed, face tilted to the clouds, rain splashing on her face as she twisted the braid on her wrist. Her lips moved, the mutterings unintelligible. Karyne swore under his breath. "That's 5 nights in a row you've gotten stuck with kitchen duty," Riverine said, his voice rising with glee. "Want to go double or nothing? I'm willing to wager that tonight she'll have some sort of vision that requires shoving her hands in the mud." "I swear you're putting her up to this." Karyne couldn't help smiling. After a day of forced rest, it had taken them a quarter moon to catch up, but they were in good spirits knowing Islara was around the corner. According to Aura, Daisy was within their reach at last. Karyne and Riverine had gotten used to Aura's strange ways over the last few weeks, more so than they'd gotten used to each other. They both knew some things would always be unforgivable. Still, the humor they found in watching her antics had somehow reformed a tentative and fragile friendship between them. Aura sucked in a breath, leaning forward to grasp her mare's mane for support. "Stop," she murmured. "Please." Aura pulled back on the reins, and the horse came to a standstill just as she slid off. She let herself fall to the muddy earth, then plunged her hands into the dirt, ignoring the way it splattered and clung to her dress. Riverine let out a snort. "You took that double or nothing bet, didn't you?" "No way!" Karyne hissed, pulling Skunk back around toward Aura's mare. "Aura? Are you all right?" Her eyes opened, her gaze almost on his face. She blinked and shook her head. "She's either in the city or just beyond. There's just—" She trailed off. Skunk pranced with impatience as Aura's face remained passive, her darting gaze the only evidence that she still followed her connection to Daisy. "Will you still be able to trace her in Islara?" Karyne asked. "I'm not sure. There's something—" Aura broke off again, eyes unfocused. Every time she lost her words, Karyne suspected it was a symptom of a greater sense of loss, maybe in time or place. The woman still kept her secrets, so he would never really know. She stood, brushing the mud off her hands, which only served to spread it further. She wiped her hands on her equally sullied dress before mounting her mare. "Something blocks me, even now. Probably just the weight of Islara. All those people and the things they've made, they interfere." Karyne and Riverine exchanged a glance, and Riverine's lips pursed as he tried holding back his grin. "We're so close." Karyne ran his thumb over the daisy on his dagger. "Once we find Daisy and the Starbridge, we can get out of this rain. Maybe get rooms at an inn. But we need to catch them before they leave." His grip tightened on his reins as he urged Skunk past Maw. The two horses nipped at each other, taking their cues from Karyne and Riverine. Karyne set a faster pace, his frustration and exhaustion finally tempered by the promise of reaching his goal. His recovery had been slow, and his pace and stamina in the days following had been even slower, but soon his tenacity would pay off. Gullet had returned, too, Enla's irate response tied to his leg. She demanded that he come give their mother the red bush tea himself, insisting that she would never forgive him or let him set foot on Starspeed again, which only made him certain he'd made the right choice. His chest tightened. What if that really had been his last voyage on Starspeed? Now the hawk kept to the trees, waiting out the rain. They probably wouldn't see him until they left Islara because of it. They headed for the closest entrance to Islara's valley at the west gate. As they reached the edge of the rim that would lead down to it, Karyne pulled his cloak tighter around him and let the hood fall down over his face, just in case there were some radical recreants who recognized him and felt burdened to do something about the royal family. But when Islara came into view, he no longer worried about hiding his identity. Every structure was blackened, every crop destroyed. Not a single living thing remained, whether plant or person. Pockets of fire and glowing embers flickered, but the rain had taken care of the worst of what had to have been an inferno. It was eerily similar to the sight that had greeted them on Bamboo Island, except this had once been a thriving city. Karyne gave the skies a quick scan, but the clouds made it difficult to see any possible threats. Riverine sucked in a breath, reining in Maw as they all took in the damage. "You think Daisy is in there?" Karyne asked Aura. Aura's mouth hung open for a moment, and Garen's panic surged higher the longer she took to respond. "I didn't. It's everywhere. No wonder I couldn't sense—" She brought her hand to her forehead, rubbing her temple with her thumb. "It wasn't just interference. It was fading." Garen's fear spiked. He patted Skunk's neck, leaning forward and tapping the horse with his heels. "Let's go, boy." "Karyne, wait," Aura called. Another set of hooves followed, but Karyne didn't look to see who it was. As Skunk picked his way down the slippery hill, Karyne kept his eyes on the sky. At one point, he swore he saw the outline of outstretched wings in the clouds, but the sky darkened as a heavier storm brewed, and soon the figure disappeared, taking on the full gray of a storm cloud ready to let loose. He didn't have much time before the scattered showers would turn to a torrential downfall. By the time he reached the city's edge, the rain had picked up. The shops nearest had been gutted, revealing their remaining contents. At one point, they'd held clothing and kitchen supplies, salted meats, and hardtack for those heading out of town. There were also vases and pottery in impressive swirling shades of blue and green, at least the pieces that hadn't been smashed or melted, souvenirs for arriving travelers. Farther down the street, Karyne entered an area with better preserved buildings that might hold survivors. Answers. Skunk fought Garen's lead, attempting to back out of the city and all its wrongness. Eventually Karyne dismounted, then patted Skunk on his rump. "Go on. You won't find any food here. Go find Walnut." The gelding took off on the hunt for Aura's mare, leaving Karyne alone on the cobblestones. Only he wasn't alone. Riverine stood beside him, daggers unsheathed, while Maw and Skunk wound their way back up the path to where Aura waited. Appreciation flooded Karyne, but he only gave the other man a quick nod. He took out his sword and tuned in to the memories around him. The sheer number of them made it impossible to follow any one trail, but they all held traces of fear, panic, and pain. There had to have been hundreds of people on this street in the last several hours for this mess of memories to remain. Had any of them been able to flee? Or had they all died? Giving up on garnering valuable information from the memories, he entered the home before him. In its prime, it would have been for an affluent family, the cobblestone of the street spreading up the building's side in an elaborate pattern that created an ocean landscape with colored glass adding depth and detail. Now, half the building was completely missing, like it had been cut in two with a knife. Wind whistled through the wall, and rain splattered furniture newly exposed to the elements. No one remained. 3 more blackened houses revealed the same abandoned atmosphere, the same eerie quiet. It wasn't until they reached a 4th house that they found the first body. "Stop," Riverin pulled on Garen's arm, preventing him from taking a step forward. Wind picked up what little ash hadn't become black mush, stirring it into tiny tornadoes but also revealing bones. Garen kneeled to wipe away wet ash clinging to bone. The body was hardly more than a skeleton with blackened additions that might have once been flesh. Garen scanned the sky again, taking a raindrop directly in his eye. He flinched and wiped his eye before placing a hand on the skull, hating what he needed to do. He closed his eyes anyway, reaching out and tuning in to the ghost-like memories around him. The faint pull of them all grew easier to distinguish. Most of them were too old to be complete, too distant to be detailed, but one grew finer-tuned as he connected to it through the bones he touched. A man, terrified and running. Only Garen wasn't just watching the man, he was reliving his memory. The lack of control made it his least favorite way to use his magic. It was like trying to wake or even move in a dream, but having no command over his body. Normally, in order to tune in to someone's memories, they had to first be recalled by the person they belonged to, but Garen's progeny mentors had pushed him to take his abilities a step further, for instances just like this. It drained him far too quickly and forced him to experience a memory with far too much perfection, like he was taking in an essence of who they were instead of just recalling their past. Even now, he felt the heat of the creature behind him, the sweat dripping down his neck as he ran. He prayed to the sun for mercy and deliverance, even though he knew it wouldn't come. Others screamed in the streets around him, and the rumble of destruction chased him along with the burning air. Then the heat overwhelmed him until he screamed in agony. His screams continued even after Riverin wrenched his hand from the skull. "You're fine. We're fine." Riverin shook Garen, bringing him back to the present reality. Garen glanced at the sky again, panting, but the rain clouds covered everything now, blocking out any sign of the sun. It had been close to sleeping moments ago, but in the memory, the sun had reached its zenith. Hours old. Surely the dragon was gone. He stood shakily, tuning in to more memories around him, the heat of them rising from the cobblestone like steam in the rain. Hundreds surrounded him, even in areas they'd already explored. Now that he knew what to look for, he sensed the origins of them all. Bodies that had been destroyed so thoroughly there weren't enough remains to mark them as people. "They're all dead," Garen whispered. "Everyone in the city." Riverin shook his head. "They must have evacuated. It's not possible that—" "I see them." Garen's curt interruption silenced Riverin. "Their memories permeate the air. All of death." He strode forward, finding the source of one memory, grasping the skull and letting himself enter another. A woman huddled over her children, as if she could absorb the creature's fire and somehow her babies would live. This time he was able to pull himself from it in the midst of her pain. Another revealed a couple sharing one last passionate embrace before their inevitable end. He tortured himself going from skeleton to skeleton, letting his energy drain as if reliving their memories somehow gave more value to their lives. He wanted to grieve them all, to experience it all for their sake. The memory of a man hiding his child in a basement was cut short as Riverin slapped him across the face. "No!" Riverin's voice brought Garen's focus back to the present, but his former friend wasn't angry. His face was drawn tight with fear. "Your sister would get that look in her eyes when she let them overtake her. The visions of the future were too much. They would have killed her. Visions of the past will do the same to you." Garen clenched his jaw, his gaze on the X covering Riveren's forehead. Riveren had still been with Enla when she'd first learned her magic. He'd seen her overdose on the addiction of prophetic visions. He'd been the one to ground her, to bring her back to the present. Until he betrayed her. It had taken Karyne and her mentor weeks to get her centered once more. Riveren was right. He'd nearly lost himself to the memories thick with sorrow pervading every part of this graveyard. Not that he would admit it to Riveren. "I'm not like my sister." He placed his hand on the skull once more, and this memory was different. He watched it again, paying closer attention, watching the path the man took until his demise on the street where Karyne stood. He shook himself free, then turned, tracing the man's path in reverse. He picked up his pace, nearly running through the ash that now clung to his boots. Riveren followed, and the slap of their boots echoed off the empty buildings in the abandoned street. When they reached the house the man had left, Karyne paused. Since the memory, the house had been smashed in two. It was unlikely anything had survived, and yet Karyne had seen the child placed in the cellar. Instead of going through the door, he picked his way through the remains, trying to make sense of the layout, trying to map out where the cellar door had been. "Here!" He pointed at a space where stone had fallen on wood floor. Wordlessly, Riveren helped Karyne uncover the floor until they found the handle and the door had been cleared. Karyne wrenched it open. Muted sunlight revealed a well-stocked storehouse, its contents practically pristine compared to the destruction above ground. His hope soared. "We're here to help," he said into the darkness. "The dragon is gone." A sniffle sounded from the corner. "Da?" Riveren stiffened beside Karyne, then rushed down the steps. Murmurs met Karyne's ears, but they soon drew closer. When Riveren emerged from the cellar, a tear-streaked little boy gripped his hand. Riveren's other arm held a sleeping infant. His protective grip so natural Karyne had a sudden image of him at home with his wife, snuggling a baby before tucking it in its crib. He wanted to hate the memory he'd inadvertently tuned into, but there was a fierce love behind it that left him breathless. The boy began shivering as the rain hit his skin. Riveren tucked the baby deeper under his cloak before making sure his X was hidden. So Karyne reached forward, beckoning the boy toward him. "Where's Da?" the boy asked, still gripping Riveren's hand. Riveren and Karyne exchanged glances. "Your father asked me to get you to safety," Karyne lied. Riveren frowned, but at least the boy came to Karyne. He lifted the boy in his arms, surprised at how light he was. The boy instinctively snuggled against Karyne, allowing Karyne's cloak to wrap around them both. "How old are you?" 3. I'll be 4 next moon. Da's going to teach me to ride his horse." Riveren looked away, swallowing hard. Even Karyne felt a lump in his throat. Hopefully there were other survivors who could take on the task of explaining what happened to his father. For now, they had to find a safe place. But where was a safe place in the midst of all this death? A low rumble interrupted Karyne's thoughts. The boy whimpered in his arms, and Riveren's eyes widened. "The southern gate," Riveren suggested, nodding toward the edge of the forest. They'd come almost halfway through the city, and the gate to the south was closer than the east or west. But were the woods any safer? Durrican hadn't touched them yet, so Karyne had to believe they could be. The two men ran, tripping over debris, and soon the infant's cries drowned out any warning they might have of the dragon's approach. As they squeezed through the fallen gate, Karyne glanced back. A dark figure loomed in the sky, finally below the clouds, but far enough away that they should be safe. They climbed the valley's edge until they reached the tree line, grateful for the cover, not just from the dragon, but from the rain. Riveren paced, hushing the baby and singing to it, distracting Karyne for another surprising moment. "This is the road to Grandpa's." The boy gazed down the path deeper into the forest. "How far away does he live?" Riveren asked. The boy shrugged. We always get there before lunch. Mama doesn't even have to stop to feed Adela. Karyne glanced back at his Lara. There was nothing there for them anyway. He needed to get to Aura. He needed Aura to trace Daisy again. I could take them and meet you back here, Riverin offered. What if I don't stay here? Karyne asked. I have to keep going if Daisy keeps going. Riverin frowned in thought, but a flutter of wings exploded from the trees, and Gullet landed on his shoulder. Karyne couldn't help grinning. Despite all that had just happened, the hawk had found them and solved their problem. He's making it harder for me to hate him. A strange look crossed Riverin's face, and Karyne realized he could say the same about his old friend. We can regroup tonight, Karyne said, passing the little boy off to Riverin. I'll send Gullet as soon as I reach the cabin, Riverin said. May the sun's light always shine upon you, Karyne murmured. Riverin's eyes flashed with hope at the farewell. And may the star's light always guide you. Karyne turned before he could examine the meaning behind the words too closely. The dragon still circled the town as if it sensed there had recently been people there alive. Karyne eyed the woods to the west, wondering if he could skirt Islara and meet back up with Aura without having to go back through the city's remains. A flash of movement in the distance caught his eye, and he squinted toward the blackened city. Several forms darted in and out of the buildings. More survivors? He tensed as the people progressed deeper into the city. They weren't trying to escape, so maybe they weren't from Islara. Daisy, Karyne breathed out before taking off down the hill, back toward the city and the dragon that had demolished it.
Chapter 43. Eliana and Lukai entered the fourth building on their street, and still found no survivors. Panic clawed up her throat at the massive devastation. Holm had said thousands lived here, and thousands more had been gathering on the eastern edges to form an army. Were they all dead? Lukai's shoulders slumped as they met back at the front door. Only the frame remained around it, but habit and the obstacle of surrounding rubble had still made them open the door and walk through. Lukai's face held weary lines, drawing Eliana out of her fears enough to remember that Lukai knew these people. Maybe he'd been to this home before its destruction. Somehow, his grief made her braver. She had no right to be swallowed up in anxiety when everyone else here had lost so much more. How did Silmar communicate with the army? Eliana asked. Messengers. Lukai scanned the street, but he didn't move forward. But his last contact point was in Valorian. That's why we went out of our way to check in. Iris and Holm said everything was on schedule. Did their contact send a message on from there? To go ahead of us? He shrugged, every movement becoming more listless. Even if it was intercepted, it was always in code. Codes can be broken, she said. He sat on the front step and dug his palms into his eyes, as if he couldn't physically go on anymore. She debated putting an arm around him, but comforting others didn't come naturally to her. It made the idea feel fabricated, forced by the bond between them, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. Holm and Kendallin stepped out from the house across the street. Kendallin reached out a hand, pulling Lukai to his feet and then wrapping him in a hug. A strange sense of heat rushed through Eliana as Lukai leaned into the other woman, both of them shaking with silent sobs. It shouldn't bother her, Not when they had a shared loss after years of friendship. But the feeling didn't go away, and beneath it, something else simmered. A sense of wrongness, like her bond had more influence over her emotions than it should be allowed. She turned her back to them, facing home, whose stricken face resembled a lost child's. She knew we were coming, didn't she? Eliana asked. She knew I was coming. Holm shook his head, his mouth opening without any words coming out. She broke Silmar's code, Eliana continued, and beat us here, crippling us in the easiest way she knew how. You don't know that. Lukai's words came out weak. There was no other explanation to offer. I'm endangering you all. As Eliana said the words, the truth of them washed over her like a wave of sorrow. It reminded her of her days under Arvid and Vera, when her energy and pain had come in undulating ripples. No one argued, which spoke volumes to Eliana. The four of them cut through the remains of an alley to meet Silmar, Iris, Velden, and Cyrus on the next street over. We'll stock up and head farther north, Silmar said, his gruff tone thicker than usual. If we catch wind of the army, we can meet up with them on the trade route. Otherwise, we'll make for the pass. The word otherwise held too much heaviness. It meant the army would have all perished. It meant they'd be on their own, performing a stealth mission to retrieve Eliana's mother and blood, instead of being one small part in a much larger plan. If Mavis knew about the army, Velden said slowly, wouldn't she watch both the trade route and the pass? Silence grew as even Silmar couldn't argue with his point. How else could we reach the Mindran Mountains? Eliana asked. Lukai shook his head. We'd be better off returning to the coast and taking boats around the Western Horn. We'd never make it before solstice, Iris pointed out. So, despite being terribly dangerous, the pass is our only option? Cyrus asked. As they all waited for someone else to confirm their dire circumstances, a low rumble came from the north. The others reached for weapons, making Eliana realize she should probably ready her bow and arrow as well. But she'd seen how little good arrows did against Duraken's hide. How certain are we that the dragon is gone? Cyrus asked. About as certain as we are about making it through the pass, Velden said. Iris shot him an irritated look. Eliana scanned the skies, the memory of Duraken's massive, scaly body so vivid, she worried she wouldn't be able to tell the past from her present reality. There. Holm pointed to the east, where a dark shadow broke up the gray clouds. Change of plans, Silmar growled. We're no longer stopping for supplies. They all followed his lead, darting between buildings and heading farther south. When Silmar veered left, Cyrus pulled up short. We're heading straight for Duraken. We're going east, Silmar corrected over his shoulder. If the dragon gets in our way, so be it. I guess it wouldn't be the first time Eliana took on a dragon, Cyrus muttered. I did not. Eliana broke off, not wanting to waste the energy on such a pointless argument. As her thoughts turned to energy, the starlock around her neck grew warm, a reminder that she had more in her arsenal this time around. It might be a fairer fight. But what good would stitches and basic healing do in the face of a dragon, whose breath would make them ashes on contact? It made all their efforts to teach her seem like such a waste of time. Eliana's anxiety grew as they moved slower and slower through the rubble, occasionally having to turn back to find a clearer path. The rumbles grew louder and the sky darker. When they finally reached the city gate, a thunderous crash resounded behind them. Eliana fell against Lukai as she turned. The dragon perched on a tower, some building that had once been a grand 5 or 6 story structure, but was now crushed into the semblance of 3, its base threatening to topple as the dragon rearranged his grip on the turrets. His wings spread out for balance, so thin that Eliana could see through them to the hills behind them in the distance. Iridescent scales shimmered all over his body and down the tail that wrapped around the tower for stability. The beast huffed, black eyes scanning the group with far too much intelligence. When his eyes landed on Eliana, he snorted, holding her gaze with a strange combination of hatred and respect. Atop Durakin's neck, a man clung to the spiked collar. The distance was too far to make out facial features, but the lanky form and dark hair was unmistakably Arvid. Silmar held out his staff, which took on its molten glow before rearranging into a metal spear.
Velden and Holm, head to the north side of the square to help block them off. Kendallin and I will stall them in the center. Iris and Lukai, get Eliana and Cyrus to Jasperus and the horses.
The others all split off to obey, Iris and Lukai dragging Eliana and Cyrus with them. From the corner of her eye, Eliana caught sight of Velden's hands spinning, drawing in water from Holmes and the earth around him. Even amidst the danger, he grinned, relishing the challenge. If he survived, he'd turn his fight with the dragon into some tall tale that made Silmar look the fool. Or maybe not. A glance back showed Silmar's face lit up with fury by the glow of his staff. Kendallin and Silmar stood in the center of the square, as if beckoning the dragon to come down and take them out like he'd done to all the buildings around them. What if that was exactly what he did? Was that their plan? Stall by self-sacrifice? Eliana stopped running. There has to be a better way. Iris tugged on her arm. We're not prepared to fight a dragon, love. So we run. You wanted to fight him before, she argued. When he had your blood, Iris said. Now the cost is too high for the reward. By this time, Velden and Holm had made it to the north side of the square, and Eliana and the others had reached the gate. Jasperus waited on the other side with the horses, but the dragon watched, his lip curling to reveal the hundreds of teeth Eliana remembered from before. Arvid bent forward, as if whispering instructions to the creature. She stopped again. Arvid and Durakin will kill them all. Look at them. They're devising a plan. They know what they're doing. Tears streamed down Iris's face, and she wouldn't hold Eliana's gaze. She knew. She knew those who stayed behind were going to die, and she'd accepted it. Eliana refused to do the same. Arvid and Durican wouldn't win if there was a surprise they hadn't factored in. How could she get the upper hand? "Jasperus," she shouted through the gate, "how far away can you project an illusion?" His brow creased. "It's best when I can touch you, like when we fought the Winnicks." "But is it passable from a distance? Can you make it look like I'm standing with Silmar?" He glanced back at Silmar and Kendallin, both adjusting their defensive stances as the dragon leaped down from the tower, scattering cobblestones in his wake. But then understanding dawned on his face. "I could make Kendallin appear enough like you to the dragon. Maybe confuse Arvid. It wouldn't fool Silmar, and if Durican got too close..." "Good enough. Do it. Once Arvid or Durican seems to realize she's a fake, change it up. Make me be in as many places at once. They came for me. Make them find me." Without waiting for a reply, Aeliana scrambled into the building on her right, to the south of the square. She heard footsteps behind her as she rushed up unsteady stairs. "What are you doing?" Cyrus caught up to her as she hunted for a window that might give her access to the roof. "This is insane. I won't let these people risk their lives for mine. If I die, I'm actually saving everyone the trouble of worrying about Mavis having my blood. Mine is the only life worth risking here." Finally, one window had a secure enough hold on the building's facade for her to step out and hoist herself up onto the roof. The building trembled beneath her, and for a moment she thought the whole structure would collapse. But another shudder made her realize Durican was on the move. She distantly registered Cyrus calling her name, but she ignored him, crawling across the roof until she could look down on Arvid, who sat astride Durican just beneath her, and Silmar and Kendallin, who faced them from the center of the square. The creature's eyes were wide with agitation, his snout dripping with water. From the north, across the square, Veldin kept a steady stream, nearly drowning the beast before it could take to the skies or send flames on the others. Aeliana hesitated, momentarily reliving all the ways she'd almost died the first night she'd encountered Durican. But then Kendallin, who had a strange mix of Aeliana's long hair and Kendallin's petite frame, shrieked, a flame from Arvid's hand igniting her cloak. Aeliana stepped to the edge of the roof and leaped. She aimed for Arvid, her boots hitting him in the side and knocking him off balance to the ground. Her momentum tried pulling her along with him, but she reached for the dragon's collar. Only one hand caught the collar's loop, and instead of giving her purchase, the awkward angle jerked her left shoulder. A sickening pop with searing heat made her yelp, and her body dangled from the collar, her legs closer to the dragon's chest than its back. Durican turned sharply to assess his attacker, which miraculously swung her legs back up toward his back. She momentarily gained purchase, freeing the arm that now hung uselessly at her side. Arvid's shouts were drowned out by a threatening rumble in Durican's throat, but they proved he'd survived the drop. Aeliana yanked another scale from the beast's back, then launched on top of his paper-thin wing, dragging the scale through the translucent skin, the same way she'd used the scale to slice through Vera's cloak. A strange howl escaped the dragon's mouth, instantly flooding Aeliana with remorse, until the gap she'd created in his wing widened, and she fell through. She landed hard on her side, unable to catch herself on the ground with her injured arm. Arvid glared down at her, his bloody hand outstretched. His blood had never given him as much magic as hers, but she supposed he had access to many more half-light's blood now, maybe even more powerful blood. She flinched when his fingers twitched, but his scowl only deepened. "That was my ride you just damaged." He backed away a step, his eyes glancing down at her neckline, at the proof of her Starlock's presence. "She won't let me kill you, but it will be worth it. You're on borrowed time. And when you belong to her, she'll do far worse than kill you." As he reached the edge of Duraken's wingspan, a dark cloud swept through him and in him, his eyes turning black. Aeliana's mouth went dry, images flooding her mind of the people he'd killed, the villages he'd destroyed, all under the influence of a dark spirit. She didn't have time to warn her friends. There was nothing she could do to stop him. But Arvid didn't fight. He simply pointed at her and grinned. "Your time's almost up." He released flames from his bloody palms, where they were met by Veldon's stream of water, and he ran off in steam as thick as fog. She turned her attention back to Duraken, who was no longer nursing his injured wing. A deafening roar left his open maw mere feet from her. A paw lifted off the ground, his talons extending. He let the paw drop over her chest, one talon drifting to a finger's breadth from her eye. As his weight shifted, the breath left her lungs until she thought he'd crush her. Then the weight released, and Duraken shook his head, as if clearing his mind. He studied her, then glanced at Kendallin, whose illusion flickered. The dragon backed away, freeing Aeliana to scramble backward and stand. He cocked his head, eyeing her one more time, as if waiting to see if she would change like Kendallin had. He wouldn't kill her. He knew who she was. Or he at least knew that Mavis wanted her alive. Before she could process what that meant, she caught sight of Cyrus above her, slicing through the dragon's other wing. "No!" she cried out. Lukai dragged her away from the dragon, blocking her view of Cyrus. "We have to get out of here." Lukai shoved her forward. She tripped over rubble, and they drew closer to the gate. "Stop, please!" She turned, and his forward momentum brought them both down. She cried out at the strain on her arm. "We have to go back for Cyrus. I have to go back. The dragon won't hurt me." She shoved Lukai aside. "That doesn't mean Arvid won't," he called after her. Fire and water rained around her, forming a smoky mist where they collided. But she kept her focus on Cyrus, who now lay beneath the dragon's wing, just like she had moments earlier. "Duraken!" She held out her right hand, steadily walking toward the beast. He looked up, distracted, just like she'd wanted. He blinked as he took her in, shaking his head with that same eerie recognition. Everyone in the square went still. Even Silmar and Veldon kept their rim magic at bay, as if they knew using them now could send Duraken over the edge. There was no sign of Arvid. "Cyrus, get behind me." Aeliana kept her voice low. "He won't hurt me." Cyrus didn't hesitate, but clambered back as Aeliana moved forward, steadily getting closer to the beast, until her hand was in arm's reach of his snout. There was a strange sense of power that came with being so close to something so deadly. She supposed it might be considered courage, but it felt a lot more like stupidity or pride. Still, cautious fear held her back, watching, waiting to see what the dragon would do. Once Cyrus was behind her, she knew she should step back, inch her way to the gate, and make her escape. But the creature before her almost seemed broken with his tattered wings. His head tilted, and he let out a slow breath, like he might lie down and cover his snout with his paws and have a good cry. "You won't hurt me," she whispered. She took another step forward, heart pounding in her ears. Her name hissed across several lips from behind her, but she kept advancing, holding her trembling hand out for the dragon to smell. He did, snorting air hot enough to burn. Then he nosed at her hand and let her rub her fingers over his snout like a horse. Images flooded Eliana's mind, and for a moment she was back at her awakening as the disjointed visions took over. But these visions were muted, blurry. Flying over forests and deserts, a collar being wrapped around her neck, a brand being seared into her paw. Her mind balked at that one, reminding her she had hands. The strangeness of it all allowed her to step outside the visions enough to realize she was seeing Durakin's memories. I hope you enjoyed listening to this first installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. To get reminders for new episodes and to stay up to date with my books, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at KarynNorton.com. You'll also get the prequel short story to Blood of the Stars in ebook and audio for free. Thanks so much for listening.